Where did you get that ring?
It's my mother's. The chain broke. I'll fix it. I'm sorry.
Where did your mother get it?
Charlotte, North Carolina, October 2025. The 40th floor of a glass tower in Uptown, where an old man had just seen a ghost. Not a ghost in the usual sense, not a figure in a doorway, not a face in a crowd. A ghost made of platinum and sapphire, bouncing across a marble conference table at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, while 6 board members discussed quarterly earnings and did not hear the sound that stopped the chairman's heart.
Make sure to subscribe and like the video. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for being here, and God bless you.
3 weeks earlier, Grace Whitfield had walked into Ashford Capital Partners for her first day of work. She was 30 years old. She had put herself through community college and then a state university on scholarships and waitressing tips. She had worked temp jobs, filing, answering phones, data entry, and built a resume through sheer competence, one 6-month contract at a time. She had $940 in savings. Her mother needed a knee replacement that Medicare would not fully cover. The executive assistant position at Ashford Capital paid nearly double her last temp salary with full benefits. She had applied because she could not afford not to. She did not know who Richard Ashford was. Her mother had never mentioned his name. Not once. Not in 30 years. Not when Grace asked about her father. Not when Grace brought home a school form that required 2 parents' signatures. Not when Grace sat in the kitchen table at 13 and said, "Mom, I need to know more about Dad." Claire had told her the same story she had always told. Your father died in a car accident before you were born. He would have loved you. His ring is in the box in the closet. That was all. That was the foundation Grace built her entire life on. A dead hero, a platinum ring, and the unshakable belief that she had been wanted by a man who simply could not stay. She was the best assistant Richard Ashford had had in a decade. Organized, anticipatory, unflappable. She arrived at 7:15 every morning and had his briefing materials collated by the time he walked in at 7:45. She brought him coffee, black, no sugar, because she had watched and learned on day 1. She did not make small talk. She did not ask personal questions. She did her job with a quiet intensity that impressed everyone in the office. The kind of intensity that comes from growing up in a household where competence was not optional, where things got done not because someone told you to do them, but because not doing them meant something would not get paid, or something would not get fixed, or your mother would have to add one more task to a list that was already impossible. Everyone was impressed, except Martin Hale. Martin Hale had been CFO of Ashford Capital for 30 years. He was 65. He had a handshake deal with a national financial group to acquire the company the moment Richard retired or was forced out. His finder's fee was $4 million. He had spent 2 years positioning his own candidates in every key role: human resources, operations, the Atlanta satellite office. Every piece was in place. The December board meeting was the end game. And this nobody from East Charlotte with a community college start and a state school degree was not part of his plan. Richard told Martin twice in the first 2 weeks that Grace should be on the management track. She's the best hire we've made in 5 years." Martin smiled and made a note and said nothing. What he thought was, "She is a threat." What he thought was, "She sees things." What he thought was, "People who see things cannot be allowed to stay." What troubled Richard, what he could not name, could not place, could not stop noticing even when he ordered himself to stop, was that Grace reminded him of someone. It was in the tilt of her head when she was thinking. It was in the way she straightened papers with both hands, palms flat, the way someone does who learned to be careful with things because there was never money to replace them. It was something in her eyes, dark, steady, watchful, that he had seen before, in another face, in another life, before he had destroyed everything that mattered, and spent 30 years pretending he had not. He could not place it. He would tell himself it was nothing, that she was simply competent, and he was simply getting old and sentimental and looking for patterns in coincidence, because his life had become a long hallway of closed doors, and he was running out of doors to open. But every morning, when she set his coffee on the desk and their hands almost touched, something in his chest tightened, something he had locked away 30 years ago in a room inside himself that he never opened, except at 2 in the morning, when he sat in his home office and opened the bottom drawer of his walnut desk and held a platinum ring with a sapphire chip and remembered the woman who had worn its twin. He would hold the ring up to the desk lamp and turn it and watch the sapphire catch the light, and he would think about the small rented house on Eastway Drive, and the kitchen table, and the 2 coffee mugs, and the woman who had looked at him with bewilderment and hurt, and the slow dawning understanding that the conversation was not a discussion but a notification. He had held that ring at 2 in the morning more nights than he could count. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late October, the chain around Grace's neck caught on her collar. The clasp gave, the ring dropped, and the sound it made on the marble, that small, clear, impossible sound, was the sound of 30 years collapsing into a single second. 1995. 30 years earlier, a small rented house on Eastway Drive, East Charlotte. Richard Ashford was 42 and building his company from nothing into something. He worked out of a rented office with 2 employees and a vision that was either brilliant or delusional, depending on which hour of the day you asked him. Claire Ashford was 40 and worked in the billing department at a regional hospital. Steady work, good benefits, the kind of job that keeps a household afloat while the other person chases a dream. They had been married 3 years. They had wanted children. It had not happened. They were happy but stretched thin, the kind of happy that requires both people to keep choosing it. And Richard had stopped choosing. He worked 80-hour weeks. He ate dinner at the office. He came home after Claire was asleep and left before she woke. Their conversations had shrunk to logistics, the electric bill, the lawn, the dripping faucet he kept saying he would fix. Claire started to feel invisible, not unloved, invisible, which is worse because unloved is at least an emotion. Invisible is just absence. Invisible is the slow discovery that you live with someone who has stopped seeing you. And the worst part is that he has not noticed he has stopped seeing you, because noticing would require the kind of attention he is giving entirely to spreadsheets and phone calls and the relentless consuming machinery of a company that does not yet exist. They were not fighting, that was the thing. Fighting would have meant they were still talking. What they were doing was something quieter and more dangerous. They were drifting, the way a boat drifts when no one is at the wheel, and Richard had convinced himself the drift was the natural order of things. He had convinced himself that marriage was supposed to feel this way after 3 years, functional, stable, quiet. He did not understand that quiet could mean peace, or it could mean the absence of something vital, and the difference between the two was the difference between a house and a tomb. Then Dale Kendrick lit the match. At a company dinner, the kind held in a steakhouse with leather booths and too much bourbon, Richard's business partner leaned over with a glass of whiskey in his fist and said, half drunk and fully careless, "Saw Claire chatting up that new associate at happy hour last Friday. She sure looked comfortable." Dale Kendrick said it the way men say things when they want to plant something without being accountable for the harvest. A grin, a shrug, a just saying, and then he turned back to his steak. He did not say Claire had done anything. He did not need to. He knew Richard. He knew that Richard Ashford was a man who did not ask questions, a man who arrived at conclusions the way a missile arrives at a target, without deviation, without course correction, without the possibility that the coordinates might be wrong. Richard said nothing. He drove home. He did not ask Claire about it. He did not mention Dale or the happy hour or the new associate. He put it in the locked room inside his chest where he stored everything he could not control, and he left it there. But it did not stay locked. Over the next 6 weeks, it grew. Every time Claire worked late, every time she did not answer her phone on the first ring, every time she laughed at something he did not say, he had no evidence. He had something worse: certainty without proof. The kind that comes from a man who was raised by a father who told him, "Trust no one with anything you can't afford to lose." The kind that hardens in the chest like calcium, not because the evidence supports it, but because questioning it would require vulnerability. And vulnerability is the one thing Richard Ashford has never been able to afford. He did not ask Claire. That was the crime. Not the suspicion. Suspicion is human. Not the jealousy. Jealousy is the shadow side of love. The crime was the silence. The crime was the decision to act on a feeling without ever testing it against reality. The crime was the absolute, granite certainty of a man who would rather lose everything than admit he might be wrong. On a November evening, he sat Claire down at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table. The same 2 mugs. But everything in the room was different now. He said, "I think we need to talk about what's going on." Claire said, "What's going on with what?" He could not say it directly. That would require vulnerability. Instead, he said, "I think we both know this isn't working." Claire's face went through bewilderment, then hurt, then a slow dawning understanding that he had already made up his mind, and this conversation was not a discussion, it was a notification. "Richard, "What are you talking about? We're fine. We've been trying for a baby. I filed this morning." She left with her car, her clothes, $2,200 in a savings account, and a platinum ring with a sapphire chip that a jeweler in Asheville had made for Richard the week before their small wedding. He had commissioned two, his and hers. The jeweler had since died. The shop had closed. There were no others in the world. He told her to keep it. He did not want to look at it. She walked out of the county courthouse on December 8th, 1995, into a gray afternoon, holding a ring that was worth more than everything else she owned combined. Not because of the platinum, because of what it used to mean. She did not know she was pregnant. She would not know for another 6 weeks. January 1996. Claire's new apartment. A one-bedroom in a brick fourplex on the east side of Charlotte. She had been divorced for 6 weeks. She had started a new position at a different hospital because she could not bear the pity in her old co-workers' eyes, the way they looked at her in the break room, the way they stopped talking when she walked in, the way they asked, "How are you?" with the specific intonation that means I heard what happened and I do not know what to say. She took a home pregnancy test on a Saturday morning because she had been nauseous for 2 weeks and she already knew. 2 lines. She sat on the bathroom floor and she did not cry. She calculated. She calculated the way women calculate when everything depends on the math being right. Rent, groceries, prenatal vitamins, the copay at the clinic, how many night shifts she could work before the pregnancy made it impossible, how many months of savings she would need, how many months she actually had. She calculated with the precision of a woman who had worked in hospital billing for 15 years and understood that numbers do not lie and numbers do not care, and the only thing that matters is whether they add up. They did not add up. She would figure it out anyway. She called Richard's office on Monday morning. She did not want to call. She did not want to ask for anything. She did not want to hear his voice, or the voice of anyone who worked for him, or the voice of anyone who had chosen his side, which was everyone because Richard Ashford did not have sides. He had a perimeter, and everyone inside it faced outward. But the child had a right to a father, and Claire was raised by a woman who taught her that doing the right thing was not optional, even when the right thing cost you the last of your dignity. The receptionist transferred her.
A man's voice answered, not Richard, his attorney. Mr. Ashford has instructed that any contact from you be directed through this office. I want to be clear, Miss Whitfield. Any further attempts to contact him directly will be documented and may be treated as harassment under North Carolina statute. Is there anything you'd like to communicate through proper channels? Claire said, "Tell him I'm pregnant. Tell him it's his." There was a pause.
She held the dead receiver against her ear for a long time, listening to the dial tone the way you listen to a sentence that has just been handed down. Then she hung up. She sat at the kitchen table, a folding table she had bought at a thrift store because the kitchen table from the house on East Way Drive was his. Everything was his. The law had made that clear. She decided 3 things. She would have this baby. She would raise this baby alone.
And she would never call that number again. She never did. The attorney did not pass the message along. Not out of malice, out of procedure. Richard's standing instructions were clear. No contact from the ex-wife. Period. The note in the file, handwritten, dated January 22nd, 1996, read simply, Claire Whitfield called re-pregnancy claim. Advised per client instructions. No contact. Documented. That note would sit in a filing cabinet for 29 years.
Richard would not learn of its existence until he went looking for it himself. And by then, the child in Claire's stomach would be 30 years old and working as his executive assistant on the 40th floor of a glass tower in uptown Charlotte, wearing his ring around her neck on a chain that was about to break. Grace Eleanor Whitfield was born on August 14th, 1996, at Charlotte Regional Medical Center. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Father, unknown. Claire made that choice deliberately. She would not put his name on the certificate. He did not deserve to be on it. He had not earned it. Earning it would have required 1 phone call, 1 question, 1 moment of doubt about his own certainty, and he had not managed any of those things. Her friend, James Tully, Pastor Tully, baptized Grace 2 weeks later in a middle basin in the fellowship hall of the small church on Central Avenue. He held the baby in his big, careful hands and said a prayer that Claire would remember word for the rest of her life, though she would never repeat it to anyone, because some things are too private even for the people you love most. The ring, Richard's ring, went on a chain. Claire wore it for a year, close to her heart, the way you carry something that hurts too much to look at, but too much to let go. Then she put it in a box on the top shelf of her closet.
When Grace was 6, she found the box and asked what it was. Claire said, "That was your daddy's ring. He gave it to me before you were born. He died in a car accident before he could meet you. He would have loved you so much." It was the lie that made everything else possible. It let Grace a dead hero instead of a living coward. It let Claire raise her daughter without bitterness poisoning the air of their small apartment every time Grace asked why she did not have a dad.
It was also a prison, and Claire knew it, and she accepted the sentence, because the alternative, telling a child that her father threw them away on a drunk man's whisper and a suspicion he never had the courage to voice, was worse than any lie she could construct. Grace wore the ring on a chain from the age of 14. She wore it to school, to her waitressing job, to her college classes, to every temp assignment and every interview and every first day of work. She wore it the way some people wear a cross or a medal or a scar, as proof of something they carry, something they do not talk about, something that defines the shape of their life even when they are not looking at it. She never took it off. It was the only thing she had from a father she had never met, and she held it close to her heart the way her mother had held it, because some inheritances are not about money or property. They are about the things we carry. The years that followed were not a montage. They were specific. They accumulated the way sediment accumulates, quietly, layer by layer, until one day you look down and realize there is something solid under your feet that was not there before. Claire's life after Richard was a study in the mathematics of survival. How many hours of work it takes to keep a child fed, housed, and educated when you are doing it alone. When you have no family money, no backup plan, no safety net except your own 2 hands and the stubborn, unremarkable courage of a woman who decided that giving up was not an option. Claire worked days in billing at the hospital, nights restocking shelves at a big box store 3 miles away. She wore a path between the 2 jobs and the apartment and the daycare and the grocery store, and she walked that path for 18 years without deviation, because deviation was a luxury she could not afford. Deviation meant a missed shift. A missed shift meant a smaller paycheck. A smaller paycheck meant the choice between groceries and the electric bill. And Claire had made that choice enough times to know that the only way to avoid it was to never miss a shift. Grace learned to cook at 9 because Claire was too tired. She did her homework at the kitchen table while her mother slept in scrubs on the couch behind her. She learned to be quiet. She learned to be careful with things. She learned to straighten papers with both hands, palms flat, because her mother straightened papers that way, and the gesture became a part of her, the way gestures become a part of us, not because we choose them, but because we inherit them. The way we inherit the shape of our faces and the color of our eyes, and the particular way we tilt our heads when we are thinking. She won a partial scholarship to a state university and waitressed for the rest. She graduated with honors. She applied for jobs with the methodical intensity of someone who understood that no one was coming to help, that the cavalry was not on its way, that the safety net did not exist, that every rung of the ladder had to be reached for and gripped and held with both hands. In 2003, Claire fell asleep driving home from a night shift. She had a guardrail on I-485 at 50 miles an hour. Titanium rod in her left hip. 6 weeks off work. Grace was 7. She rolled herself to her desk at the hospital billing department, and she typed, and she filed, and she answered phones, and she did not complain, because complaining would have required admitting that this was hard, and admitting it was hard would have been the first crack in the wall she had built to keep everything out. She never filed for disability. She never asked for help from anyone, except Pastor Tully, who brought groceries on Thursdays for 6 months and would not accept $1 in return. She never called Richard's office again. She never looked him up. She never typed his name into a search engine. She did not want to know what he had become, because knowing would have required her to feel something about him, and she had used up every ounce of feeling she had on the task of keeping Grace fed and housed and educated and unbroken. In 2019, Claire retired. Bad hip, worse knee. She needed a knee replacement, but Medicare would not cover the specific procedure her surgeon recommended. She was on a wait list. Grace helped with the copays for her medications.
They lived 12 minutes apart. They had dinner together every Sunday. Grace wore her mother's ring on the chain under her shirt. close to her heart. She did not think about it much anymore. It was just part of her, like her mother's dark eyes, like her own stubborn refusal to ask for help, like the way she straightened papers with both hands, palms flat.
Meanwhile, 12 miles west in the South Park neighborhood, Richard Ashford ate dinner alone in a 12-room house 6 nights a week. The 7th night he ate with Martin Hale at a steakhouse, and they talked about numbers and never about anything that mattered. He had built Ashford Capital from a $15,000 loan and a rented desk in a strip mall office into a firm that managed $2.4 billion in assets. He had offices in Charlotte, Atlanta, and Raleigh.
He had 73 employees. He had a corner office on the 40th floor with a view of the city he had helped build. He had everything a man could build, and nothing a man could keep. He had married again in 2000, a woman named Doreen, kind and patient, who left him in 2010 after 15 years because, as she told him at the kitchen table, it was like living with a man behind glass. Because a man who tells you it's nothing while holding another woman's wedding ring at 3 a.m. is a man who has decided that you do not deserve the truth. And Doreen Ashford had spent 15 years being told she did not deserve things. He had no heir, his board was circling, his legacy was a company with no one to inherit it. And the irony, which he did not yet know, was that his heir had been filing his correspondence for 3 weeks. She was sitting 20 feet from his office door, wearing his ring around her neck, and neither of them had any idea. The universe had put the answer to every question Richard Ashford had ever asked within arm's reach. And the universe was waiting, with the patience of a jeweler filing down a setting, for a chain to break.
Grace started at Ashford Capital on October 1st. She was exceptional from day one, and Richard noticed it, the way a man notices something he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting, with the unsettled attention of someone who hears a melody he recognizes but cannot name. She anticipated problems before they arrived. She managed his calendar with surgical precision. She did not complain when he worked past 9 in the evening and needed documents reprinted. She brought solutions, not questions. In 19 days, she had reorganized his filing system, flagged 3 scheduling conflicts his previous assistant had missed, and earned the grudging respect of every department head on the 40th floor. Every department head except one. Richard began to rely on her in a way that made Martin nervous. "She reminds me of someone," Richard told Martin one afternoon in the hallway between offices. He did not elaborate. He could not elaborate.
He did not know who. He only knew that every time Grace tilted her head while reading a document, something in his chest moved. Not pain, not pleasure. Something older than both. Something that lived in the part of his brain where he stored the things he had tried to forget. The things he had buried under 30 years of work and wealth, and the particular kind of loneliness that rich men confuse with independence. Martin, meanwhile, was running his own calculations.
He had spent 2 years building his acquisition deal with a national financial group that wanted Ashford Capital's client list and was willing to pay a premium for it. He had placed his people in human resources, in operations, in the Atlanta satellite office. The board meeting was in December. His proposal, framed as a strategic partnership, was in fact a full acquisition that would push Richard into an advisory role, a velvet coffin. The company would be sold. Martin would pocket his $4 million finder's fee, and Richard Ashford, the man who had built this firm from nothing, would be erased from his own creation. The only thing Martin needed was for Richard to have no heir, no successor, no one to pass the torch to. As long as Richard was alone, as long as the board could argue that there was no continuity plan, no next generation, the acquisition was inevitable. Martin had been counting on Richard's loneliness.
He had been banking on it for 2 years. And then Richard started talking about promoting the new secretary. Grace did not know any of this. She did not know about the acquisition deal. She did not know Martin was threatened by her competence. She did not know that the man she brought coffee to every morning at 7:45 was the same man who had sat across a kitchen table from her mother 30 years ago and said, "I think we both know this isn't working."
She knew only that her mother needed a knee replacement, that her rent was due in 11 days, that this job was the best thing that had happened to her in years, and that the chairman had a habit of staring at her face with an expression she could not read, an expression that was not attraction and not suspicion, but something else, something she did not have a name for because the thing it was had never been directed at her before. She did not know it was recognition.
It sat in his chest like a coin that had been dropped and was still ringing, and he could not pick it up because picking it up would mean admitting he had dropped it in the first place. And in 3 days, the ringing would have a name. The name would be Claire, and the feeling would stop being a mystery and start being a reckoning. The boardroom, Tuesday morning, October 28th. Quarterly review with 6 board members. Grace leaned across the table to hand Richard a bound report. The chain around her neck, thin, silver, worn smooth by years of contact with her skin, caught on her collar. The clasp gave. The ring, platinum, small, with a chip of pale blue sapphire, dropped onto the marble conference table. It bounced once. It spun. It made a sound that was impossible to hear, unless you had spent 30 years listening for it. The room continued talking. No one noticed. Quarterly earnings, regional performance, the Atlanta office expansion. The numbers and the voices filled the room like weather. Except Richard. That night, 2 in the morning, the walnut desk, the bottom drawer, the velvet box. He held his ring up to the desk lamp. He turned it. The sapphire caught the light. The same pale blue. The same angle. The same small fire inside the stone. He had held this ring 1,000 times. He had never held it next to its twin. He had never seen its twin since the day he told Claire to keep it, 30 years ago, because he did not want to look at it. Because looking at it meant seeing her face, and seeing her face meant admitting what he had done. He sat at that desk until the sun came up. The next morning, he asked his office manager to pull Grace Whitfield's personnel file. It was thin, a few pages, typed, the ordinary documentation of an ordinary employee. Previous employment, 3 temp agencies, a dental office, a property management company. Education, community college transfer to a state university. Emergency contact, Claire Whitfield, mother. Home address, East Charlotte. Claire, Whitfield. Claire's maiden name was Whitfield.
Before she was Claire Ashford, before she signed the papers, before she walked out of the county courthouse on December 8, 1995, into a gray afternoon, holding a ring that was worth more than everything else she owned combined. He drove to the county courthouse during lunch. He did not call his attorney. He did not delegate. He went himself, because this was not a task he could hand to someone else. This was personal in the oldest sense of the word. This was between him and the truth had been waiting for him in a courthouse filing cabinet for 30 years with the patience of something that knows it will be found eventually. He requested the divorce filing from November 1995. Ashford v. Ashford. Irreconcilable differences. No children listed. Final decree signed December 8th. He requested birth records for August 1996 in the county. He narrowed my mother's name, Claire Whitfield. One result. Grace Eleanor Whitfield, born August 14th, 1996. Father, unknown. He did the math. December 1995 to August 1996. 8 months. She was pregnant when she signed the papers. She was pregnant and she did not know. Or she did know and she did not tell him. Or she tried to tell him and he called his old attorney's firm.
They pulled the file from storage, a banker's box in a warehouse on the west side of Charlotte. Dusty, taped shut, labeled with a case number from another century. There was a note, handwritten, dated January 22nd, 1996. Claire Whitfield called re-pregnancy claim. Advised per client instructions, no contact. Documented. She tried to tell him. She called. She was blocked. Not by malice, by bureaucracy. By the machine Richard himself had built to protect himself from feeling anything. He had built a wall of attorneys and instructions and standing orders, and that wall had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had kept the truth out. It had kept Claire out. It had kept his daughter out. For 30 years. His attorney knew. His attorney followed orders. The note was filed. The file was closed. And Claire raised their daughter alone, while Richard ate dinner in a 12-room house and wondered why he could not sleep. He sat in the courthouse parking lot for 45 minutes. The parking enforcement officer gave up and left. Richard sat and he held the steering wheel, and he looked at the gray concrete of the building where the records lived, and he felt every one of his 72 years settle on him like stones. Not the weight of age, but the weight of consequence, which is heavier. Because age is something that happens to you, and consequence is something you built. That evening, Richard drove to East Charlotte. He had not been to this part of the city in decades. The Charlotte he knew was uptown, glass towers, steakhouses, the kind of restaurants where the wine list is longer than the menu. East Charlotte was a different geography. Not poor, not neglected, but modest in the specific way that American neighborhoods are modest when the people who live in them work with their hands and their backs and their endurance rather than their ambition and their connections. He passed the block where he and Claire had lived. The little rented house on Eastway Drive was now a taqueria with a hand-painted sign and a string of lights across the porch. He slowed the car and looked at it and felt something that was not nostalgia and not regret, but something heavier. The weight of a door you walked through and can never walk back through, because the room behind it no longer exists. The kitchen table where he had said, "I filed this morning," was gone. The counter where Claire leaned while he did not look up from his papers was gone. The house was gone. Everything was gone, except the consequence. He found Claire's current address from the personnel file. It was a modest duplex with a chain-link fence and a concrete porch. There were potted geraniums by the front door, red, well-tended, the kind of plants that require daily attention from someone who believes that the small things matter. The paint was peeling, but the windows were clean. He imagined Claire in there, 70 years old, bad hip, bad knee, alone. He imagined 30 years of alone. He imagined the pregnancy test and the phone call and the attorney's voice and the silence that came after. The permanent architectural silence of a man who had sealed every door so the truth could not get in. He imagined Grace at 6 asking about the ring. He imagined Claire kneeling on a bedroom floor, holding an open box, inventing a dead hero because the truth was too cruel for a child to carry. He walked up the 3 concrete steps. He knocked. Claire opened the door. She was smaller than he remembered. Her hair was silver now, cut short and practical. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked at him through the screen door, and she knew immediately, not because of his face, which had aged in ways she could not have predicted, but because of the way he stood, the weight in his left leg, the way he held his hands at his sides, like a man who does not know what to do with them. She had married that posture.
She told him the truth, the way a person tells the truth when they have been carrying it for 3 decades and have no more room for it inside them. Not with anger, not with tears, but with the flat, exhausted precision of a woman who has rehearsed this speech 1,000 times in her head and never expected to deliver it. You had your lawyer threaten me with harassment charges because I tried to tell you about your own child. So no, Richard, you may not come in. I didn't know.
I swear I didn't know about the call.
You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You decided I was guilty and you sealed every door so the truth couldn't get in. That's not ignorance, Richard. That's architecture. She closed the door. Not a slam. Quietly. The click of the deadbolt was louder than any shout.
It was the loudest sound Richard Ashford had ever heard. Louder than the ring on the marble. Louder than the attorney's voice on the phone 30 years ago. Louder than the silence in his 12-room house at 2 in the morning when he sat in the dark and held a ring and wondered what he had done. Richard stood on the porch. He stood there for a long time. The geraniums were at his feet. The porch light buzzed. A car passed on the street behind him. He put his hand on the screen door. Flat. The way you put your hand on a wall when you need something solid to remind you that you are still standing. Then he walked back to his car. He sat behind the wheel. He did not start the engine. He sat in the dark on that quiet street in East Charlotte, and he felt the specific weight of a man who has been given the exact truth he deserved and cannot lift it. That was not ignorance, Richard. That's architecture. He would hear that sentence every night for the rest of his life. Every time he opened the bottom drawer. Every time he held the ring. She had built a sentence that would outlast anything he had ever built. Because it was true. And the truth has no expiration date. And the truth does not depreciate. And the truth does not require maintenance. It simply is. It simply waits. And when it finally arrives, it arrives with the weight of every year it was kept out.
Richard did not sleep. He went to the office the next morning looking like a man who had been struck by something heavy and slow, something that did not knock him down, but changed the way he walked, the way he held his shoulders, the way he looked at the world through the glass walls of his office. Grace was already at her desk. She handed him his coffee. He took it. Their fingers did not touch. She went back to her work. He said nothing. He could not say it here.
He could not say it at all. He was a man who had controlled every outcome for 40 years, and this was the one thing he could not fix with a phone call or a contract or a check. This required something he had never developed, the capacity to be vulnerable in front of another person without turning the vulnerability into a transaction. Martin noticed. Martin always noticed. He asked Richard if everything was all right. Richard said, "Fine." Martin made a note on his phone. He had been documenting Richard's episodes, the late arrivals, the distracted meetings, the canceled dinners, for 6 months. The board needed a pattern of decline. Martin was building one, the way a man builds a case, one observation at a time, one note at a time, one more piece of evidence that the chairman was losing his grip and the company needed new leadership. That weekend, Claire called Grace. "Come over. I need to tell you something." Her voice was different. Not upset, not calm, but the specific texture of something being held back for the last time, about to be released. Grace had heard that voice before. She had heard it when her mother told her about the titanium rod. She had heard it when her mother told her the car was going to be repossessed. She had heard it every time Claire was about to deliver a fact that would require Grace to rearrange her understanding of the world. Grace drove to her mother's duplex. Claire sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where Grace had done her homework at age 8, where Claire had paid bills at midnight, where they had eaten Sunday dinners for 25 years, where the ring had been shown to a 6-year-old girl with wide eyes and careful hands. And Claire told her everything: the marriage, the divorce, the lie about the car accident, the real reason she never named a father on the birth certificate, the call to the lawyer, the ring. The man who came to the porch last night, the man who built Ashford Capital Partners, the man whose name was on the building where Grace worked, the man she had been bringing coffee to every morning for 3 weeks. Grace listened without interrupting. Her mother's voice was steady, the voice of a woman who had been carrying this story for 30 years and had refined it down to its essential facts, the way a stone is refined by water. When Claire was finished, Grace stood up. She walked to the kitchen window. She looked out at the backyard, a small square of grass with a clothesline and a plastic chair, and nothing else. "You told me he was dead." "I know." "You lied to me for 30 years."
I did. Why? Because the truth was worse, Claire said. The truth was that your father threw us away because he was too proud to ask me a simple question. I wanted you to have a father who would have loved you if he could have, even if he was made up. Even if I had to build him out of nothing, I would rather you had a dead hero than a living coward. Grace was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light shifted in the window. A bird called from the clothesline pole. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the specific warmth of a house where someone has been sitting for a long time, waiting to say something they have been waiting 30 years to say. Then, and now he's my boss. Yes. Does he know? He came to my door last night. He knows. Grace picked up her car keys from the table. I have to go. Grace! I'm not angry at you, Mom. I understand why you did it. But I need to think. I need to think about what this means and who I am, and whether any of the things I believed about myself are still true. I need to think about that alone. She drove home. She did not sleep either. She sat in her small apartment in East Charlotte, and she looked at the ring on the chain, and she thought about the man in the charcoal suit who stared at her face every morning with an expression she could not read. And now she could read it. Now she knew what that expression was. It was recognition. It was the slow, agonizing recognition of a man looking at his own daughter and not knowing it, and knowing something and not knowing what the something was. She thought about that for a long time. On Monday morning, she arrived at Ashford Capital at 6 o'clock, an hour before anyone else. She typed a one-page letter of resignation. She placed it on Richard's desk. She took her personal items from her drawer, a photograph of her mother, a granola bar, a pen she liked. She left before he arrived. Richard found the letter at 7:45. He read it once. He read it again. He put it in his drawer, the same drawer where he kept the ring, the same drawer he opened at 2 in the morning, the same drawer that now held the only two things in the world that mattered to him: a ring he could not return, and a letter he could not answer. He did not call her. He did not send anyone after her. For the first time in his life, Richard Ashford understood that there was a situation he could not solve by doing more. He could only solve it by doing less. By waiting. By being still. By not being the man who controlled everything. He had spent 40 years building a career on the principle that action was always better than inaction. And now the only correct action was to sit in his chair and do nothing, and let the two women he had hurt decide whether he was worth the risk of another conversation. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. And he was not certain he was capable of it. Three things happened in November. The first was about Martin. Before Grace left, she had organized 3 years of Richard's financial correspondence. She was thorough, the way people are thorough when thoroughness is the only advantage they have ever had. When you cannot afford connections or credentials or the particular confidence that comes from money,
You make yourself indispensable through precision. In doing so, she had flagged a series of emails between Martin and an outside acquisition group. Emails that were supposed to be in Martin's private files, but had been misfiled in the general correspondence folder. Possibly by Martin's own assistant. Possibly by carelessness. Possibly by the universe's particular sense of timing. Grace had placed them in a separate folder, labeled CFO, flagged for review, possible conflict. She did not know what they meant. She was just being careful with things, the way her mother had taught her to be careful with things, the way people are careful when they know that carelessness costs money they do not have. Richard found the folder 2 weeks after Grace's resignation. He read the emails. He understood immediately. Martin had been negotiating the sale of Ashford Capital behind his back for 2 years. The December board meeting was the end game. The finder's fee was $4 million. The betrayal was comprehensive, methodical, and patient. Exactly the kind of betrayal Richard should have recognized, because he had committed exactly the same kind of betrayal against his own marriage 30 years ago. Richard read from the email at the emergency board meeting. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. He read the words in a flat, measured tone that was more devastating than any anger, because the words spoke for themselves. The acquisition terms, the finder's fee, the timeline, the list of Martin's allies in the company. When he finished reading, Martin said, "You have no succession plan, Richard. You have no heir. The company needs continuity." Richard looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You're fired. Get your things." Martin left Ashford Capital that afternoon. He took his briefcase, and his pocket square, and his 30 years of service, and his $4 million that would arrive arrive. And he walked to the elevator, and the doors closed. And that was the end of Martin Hale. The acquisition was dead. The board was restructured, and the folder that killed it had been labeled by a woman who was no longer in the building, a woman who straightened papers with both hands, palms flat, because her mother had taught her to be careful with things. The second thing was about Pastor Tully. Richard did not know Claire had a pastor friend. He found out by going back to her neighborhood and asking a woman at the corner store if she knew Claire Whitfield. The woman said, "Everybody knows Claire. Talk to Pastor Tully. He's in the yellow house on the corner." She said it with the certainty of a person who understands that some people are landmarks, and Pastor Tully was a landmark. Richard knocked on Tully's door. Tully knew who he was immediately. He had been expecting this visit for 28 years. They sat on Tully's screened porch with glasses of sweet tea. October afternoon. The light going amber through the screen. The neighborhood quiet in the way southern neighborhoods get quiet when the day starts to wind down. The children inside. The porches occupied by people with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Was she ever? Did she? Was I wrong? Tully sipped his tea. He set it down carefully, the way a man sets down something fragile. He looked at Richard with the patient, unsurprised expression of a pastor who has heard confessions for 40 years and has learned that the real question is never the one that is asked first. She never cheated on you, Richard. Not once. Not ever. She loved you.
She loved your marriage. And you threw her out because a drunk man at a dinner party said something stupid, and you were too proud to have a conversation. Richard's head dropped. He stared at his untouched tea. The ice was melting. The condensation ran down the glass and pooled on the table. He watched it pool, and he thought, this is what 30 years of certainty looks like. A puddle on a table. A ring in a drawer. A daughter he never held. What do I do? Tully sipped his tea. You can't undo 30 years, Richard. You can't buy your way back in. You can't fix it with a grand gesture. Claire doesn't need your money. Grace doesn't need your name. They survived without you. They're not broken. You are. Then what? Be small. Be patient. Don't ask for anything. Earn the right to be in the room. That might take a year. It might take 10. You might die before it happens. That's the cost. Richard looked at his tea. He had not touched it. The ice was melting. The afternoon was fading. He understood. The cost of 30 years of certainty was not a number. It was not something that could be calculated or projected or managed. It was time. It was the one resource he could not acquire, the one investment he could not make, the one thing his money and his power and his corner office could not buy back. The third thing was about the scholarship. Richard endowed a fund at the community college where Grace had started her education. Not in his name, not in Grace's name, in the name of Eleanor Whitfield, Claire's mother, Grace's grandmother, the woman who had helped Claire survive the first year when there was no money and no help and no one to call at 2 in the morning when the baby would not stop crying and the rent was due. The Eleanor Whitfield Scholarship for Working Mothers, funded with $2 million. No publicity, no press release, no plaque with his name. He wrote one letter to Claire, by hand, on plain white paper. Not the expensive stationery from his office. Not the embossed cardstock with his company's logo. Plain paper. A pen. His handwriting, which was unsteady now, because his hands had been shaking since the night on the porch. I can't fix what I did.
I can try to make the road a little easier for someone who walks the one you walked. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. R. She put the letter in the shoebox under her bed, next to the divorce papers. She did not throw it away. She did not frame it. She put it where she kept the things that mattered, not because they were precious, but because they were evidence. Evidence of a life lived. Evidence of a marriage broken.
Evidence of a man who had taken 30 years to write 2 sentences that his wife had needed to hear 30 years ago. She closed the lid. She stood up. She walked to the stove and made coffee, because that is what Claire Whitfield did. She made coffee. She went to work. She raised her daughter. She kept going. She had been keeping going for 30 years, and one letter on plain paper was not going to change the rhythm of a life that had learned to survive without the man who wrote it.
But she did not throw it away. That was the thing. She did not throw it away. December, a Saturday morning. Grace called Ashford Capital's main number. The new receptionist answered. Grace did not ask for Richard. She asked for the general voicemail. She left a message. This is Grace Whitfield. I'd like to have coffee with Mr. Ashford. Saturday, if he's available. The diner on Central Avenue. 10 o'clock. Richard played the message 4 times. The diner on Central Avenue. It had been there since 1987.
Vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that came in thick ceramic mugs without being asked. The kind of place where the waitress calls you honey, and the specials are written on a white board and marker, and the check comes on a piece of paper torn from a pad. Richard arrived at 9:40. He sat in a booth by the window. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing a button-down shirt, no tie, the sleeves rolled to the forearm. He had thought about this. He had thought about what a man wears when he is trying to be small. He ordered coffee. He waited. Grace arrived at 10:02. She was wearing a simple coat, jeans, boots. The ring was on the chain, visible this time. She had not tucked it in. She slid into the booth across from him. She did not smile. She did not extend her hand. "Thank you for coming," Richard said. "I almost didn't." A pause. The waitress brought Grace coffee without being asked. Small city diners know things. "I read about the scholarship," Grace said. "Mom told me." I'm not trying to. I know what you're not trying to do. You've been not trying to do a lot of things for 30 years. Richard absorbed that. He deserved it. He nodded. The door opened again. Claire walked in. She was wearing her blue cardigan and her reading glasses. She looked at Richard. She looked at Grace. She slid into the booth next to her daughter. She did not explain why she was there. Grace did not explain how she knew to come. Some things are arranged between mothers and daughters, in conversations that take place entirely in the silence between phone calls, in the way a sentence is left unfinished, in the way a question is asked, and then answered with a pause that contains everything. 3 coffee cups, 3 people. No one is smiling. No one is crying. No one is leaving. That is where the story pauses. Not ends, pauses. Because forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that means anything, the kind that costs something, is not a scene, it is a season. And this season is just beginning. The ring is in a velvet box in Richard's desk drawer. He has not earned it back. Maybe he never will. Maybe earning it back is not the point. Maybe the point is that he stopped controlling the outcome and let the people he had hurt decide what happened next. Maybe the point is that Grace called, not to forgive, not to accuse,
not to demand anything, just to sit in a diner booth and drink coffee and see if the man across from her was capable of being small, of being quiet, of not fixing, of just sitting there. I have been thinking about this story for a while now, about what it says and what it does not say. It does not say that Richard Ashford is a good man. He is not.
He was a man who let suspicion curdle into certainty without ever asking the question that would have saved everything. He was a man who built a wall of lawyers and silence around himself and called it protection when it was really cowardice. He was a man who ate dinner alone for 30 years and never once drove to the east side of Charlotte to see if the woman he had thrown away was still alive. But here is what the story does say.
It says that Claire Whitfield raised a daughter on nothing, on hospital billing shifts and night restocking, and a titanium rod in her hip, and a lie she told because the truth was crueler than anything she could invent. And she did it without complaint. She did it without bitterness. She did it with the kind of stubborn, ordinary courage that does not make the evening news, and does not win awards, and does not get a corner office on the 40th floor.
It says that Grace Whitfield, who learned to cook at 9 because her mother was exhausted, who straightened papers with both hands because her mother straightened papers that way, who wore a dead man's ring on a chain because it was the only inheritance she had, walked into the same company her father built, and was the best person in the building without knowing she was his daughter. She did not need his name. She did not need his money.
She did not need his 40-room office, or his 12-room house, or his $2.4 billion in managed assets. She needed a job, and she was good at it, and that was enough. It says that a ring can travel 30 years on a chain around a woman's neck and still find its way back to the man who gave it away.
It says that the sound of metal on marble, that small, clear, impossible sound, can stop time if the person hearing it has been waiting 30 years for something he did not know he was waiting for. And it says that sometimes the hardest thing a powerful man can do is sit in a $4 diner booth and not fix anything, not write a check, not make a speech, not control the outcome.
If this story moved something in you, if you have ever thrown away something precious because you were too proud to ask a simple question, or if you have ever been the one who was thrown away and had to rebuild from nothing, or if you have ever kept a ring on a chain for 30 years because some things are too important to forget and too painful to look at, leave a comment below and tell us about it. We read every one. And if there is someone in your life who needs to hear this today, someone who is sitting in a 12-room house eating dinner alone, or someone who is working double shifts so their daughter can have a better life, or someone who is wearing a ring on a chain and does not know the whole story, share this video with them. Do not wait for the right moment. The right moment is now. Subscribe so you do not miss the next story. There are more Claires out there, more Graces. And the cost of that certainty, the 30-year, bone-deep, irreversible cost of it, was a daughter he never held, a woman he never called, a ring he kept in a drawer, and a sound on a marble table that he will hear for the rest of his life. That is the whole secret, friends. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not be certain.